This is the brand new Huawei Pura 80 Ultra, and this is the Vivo X200 Ultra, and this is the Samsung S25 Ultra. We'll compare the photo and video capabilities of these top-tier camera phones. Well, friends, let's go! Hey friends, this video was translated using AI, so the sound quality isn't the best. If you want to listen to the original sound from the smartphones and hear the audio recording tests, just follow the link to our original video in the description. We have all three smartphones fully charged to 100%. Let's go film. And as per tradition, our first test is the 4K 60 FPS front-facing camera. Here's how the smartphones perform with the sunset behind me. The sky is looking really beautiful. And how is the dynamic range overall? Is everything okay on all of our smartphones? When shooting in good lighting, the main difference is in color reproduction. On the left, we see the brightest and warmest image. The Vivo result is slightly cooler and more contrasty. The video on the right from Samsung is the darkest, most saturated, and coldest. However, all three smartphones provide quite similar results in terms of quality and detail. When shooting against the light, the Huawei gives us a rather cool and flat result. There's a distinct lack of contrast on the face, and the image looks more interesting with the competitors in this regard. Vivo's video came out warm, and uniquely, its sky isn't blue, but rather a rosy hue. Samsung's result, once again, is darker, more saturated, and has more contrast than the others. In the stabilization test, the X200 Ultra performed the worst, while the Pura 80 Ultra and Samsung handled it confidently. Incidentally, Vivo should have an advantage in this test, as the two phones on the edges have a wider range of motion when the tripod is shaken. But even so, it still lost to its competitors. Right away, I'd like to praise Samsung for how it records sound in noisy environments. We'll have a separate audio test later, but you can already hear the difference. Unlike the competitors, the S25 Ultra cuts out the fountain noise in the background, which makes my voice sound clearer. Interestingly, it's really cool that during 4K 60 FPS video recording, Huawei allows you to shoot with this wide-angle view. It's noticeably wider than on the Vivo and the Samsung, and you can create a 2x angle when only your face is in frame. We also have this feature. The zoom feature on the front camera is a handy trick, giving us flexibility for taking selfies in different situations. Now, what are the camera specs in general? The Huawei Pura 80 Ultra is equipped with a 13-megapixel front-facing camera with an f2.0 aperture. The Vivo X200 Ultra, in turn, received a 50-megapixel sensor with an f2.45 aperture. And the Samsung S25 Ultra features a 12-megapixel selfie camera with an f2.2 aperture. I enabled Dolby Vision on the Vivo and HDR on the Samsung. And this is the kind of image we get from the front camera in 4K 60 FPS. What I see on the Samsung is that the face is noticeably dark. On the Vivo, it seems nothing has changed at all. Basically, if you rotate it like this, the image is practically identical to what it was in normal mode. On the Huawei, unfortunately, I can't even enable Dolby Vision here. Because of that, the front camera shoots like this. On the Samsung, you can make the face brighter. To do this, we tap on the face, lock it, so to speak, and increase the brightness a little. But with the brighter image, details are lost. Now I can see on the Samsung that my face is completely blown out, so this shooting with exposure lock only works when stationary. If you move, it's probably not the best choice. I wouldn't say that HDR on the front cameras of the Vivo and Samsung somehow improved the situation when shooting in difficult conditions. This really isn't the kind of camera where extended dynamic range can actually make a difference. So I won't even fault the Pura 80 Ultra for lacking HDR. I've now enabled portrait video mode with background blur. Unfortunately, the Huawei doesn't have such a function at all. The Vivo records full HD at 30 frames per second, while the Samsung can record 4K at 30 frames per second. Yes, friends, unfortunately, Huawei's 2025 flagship can't even shoot portrait video on the front camera, not even in full HD. The front camera on the Vivo felt a bit uncertain here. When I rotate the camera, the video looks a bit shaky. Samsung delivers the most confident results. The picture is smooth, and it's in 4K too. I also note that Vivo, as usual, boosts the exposure to ensure the face is well lit. But because of this, the sky is quite overexposed. Samsung is the opposite. The exposure is lower. The sky looks better, but the foreground is the darkest. Now we have shooting in difficult conditions. We're at a very busy road here. It's a two-lane road, but cars are driving right next to us. And the sound reflects and gets into our phones. How do our smartphones handle these conditions? There's a noisy road here, so traffic is passing by. Quite a lot of cars. And we also have wind blowing now. So, how will the audio recording sound on our 3 cameras? These are the Huawei Pura 80 Ultra, the Vivo x200 Ultra, and the Samsung S25 Ultra. This is how the voice sounds if you enable voice enhancement on the Vivo x200 Ultra. I don't have such a mode on the Huawei. On the Samsung S25 Ultra, it's just basic sound recording, a standard voice recording mode. And this is what my voice sounds like when recording with a DJI Mic 2 with a DJI Osmo Pocket 3. Huawei's noise reduction seems to be activating automatically, which results in a slightly compressed sound. Vivo has cleaner audio, but you can hear wind blowing, and sometimes you can hear an echo of my voice comes through in the background when I'm speaking. But these are minor things, and overall the sound on the X200 Ultra is almost as good as Samsung's Morant. In turn gave us arguably the cleanest recording. Now on the Samsung S25 Ultra, I've connected the professional video recording mode. My dynamic range immediately dropped. But now I can choose the direction of the audio recording. Now the omnidirectional microphone is recording me. Now on the Samsung S25 Ultra, sound is only coming through the front microphone. And, in theory, the audio recording quality should be much better now. Noise cancellation, I'm really reducing all the noise now. And, in theory, this sound from the cars shouldn't be audible. On the Huawei, we simply can't adjust noise reduction. We can't turn it off at all, nor can we boost the voice. Nothing can be done. Vivo's sound profile has definitely become more emphasized, but the background sounds have become more compressed, which makes sense. Samsung offers the richest set of sound recording options. We've talked about this many times in other reviews. But with the S25 Ultra, I don't think there's any need to switch to Pro mode or change microphones, since the audio is recorded excellently even in regular recording. Let's move on to video recording with the main camera module, starting with the ultra-wide lenses. On the Huawei, we see the darkest and perhaps the most blurry image. Vivo's result is the brightest and with extremely high sharpness. Because of this, the video appears the clearest among all. But we'll examine real detail in the zoom test. Samsung's result is somewhere between Vivo and Huawei. All 3 videos have differences in white balance and color reproduction. For example, the sky turned out with a different shade on each. What else is worth looking at here? Well, the street lights. On the Pura 80 Ultra they are yellow, while on the others they are red. They are red in real life, so Huawei missed the mark with the color here. We're testing stabilization, and all 3 smartphones performed confidently during the running test. When filming selfies, we see that the Pura 80 Ultra gives us the widest viewing angle. Samsung has a slightly narrower angle, and Vivo has the narrowest. Of course, the very different color rendition immediately stands out. On the left, we get the coldest result with a pale grayish skin tone. In the center, we get the warmest picture with a neutral skin color. To the right, we again see the darkest and most saturated result with a reddish tint on the face. By the way, Samsung captured the color of my sweater most accurately, while Vivo made it look paler, and Huawei shifted it to turquoise. In terms of video detail, Vivo and Samsung look extremely similar. Facial details, hair, and clothing texture are all equally discernible. Huawei's result is weaker, and for example, the face looks quite blurry. In the stabilization test, all 3 smartphones performed roughly the same. I can't single anyone out here. Let's switch to the main lens on the Huawei and Samsung. Meanwhile, on the X200 Ultra, 1x is a crop from the ultra-wide lens. Therefore, it's not surprising that Vivo delivers the weakest result at this zoom level. Of course, the videos on the left and right look more detailed and sharper. However, I'll reiterate that Huawei rendered the red lights yellow. We also see that the video on the left is slightly overexposed, which results in blown-out highlights in the sky and along the edge of the tower. The stabilization test showed that the 80 Ultra and S25 Ultra performed confidently. Vivo, however, wobbles with every step, although the result is decent for digital zoom. We have the same story when filming selfies. Digital crop on the Vivo, of course, can't compete with the 1x optical zoom of the competitors. So let's move on to 1.5x zoom on the Vivo, and compare all 3 main cameras. Switching to the main lens on the Vivo, shooting everything around visually, there are no differences in detail between the images. But there is a difference in color reproduction. We're getting a different white balance, exposure, and sky color again. Which of these you prefer is a matter of taste. All 3 handled stabilization excellently. The videos are smooth, without sharp jerks or shakiness. When shooting yourself, there aren't significant differences in detail between the videos. Overall, all 3 images look great. Again, the difference lies in the color. Huawei delivers the brightest video with a yellowish skin tone. Vivo's result is more neutral, while Samsung offers the warmest with a reddish skin tone. The smartphones handled shooting against the light differently. The 80 Ultra loses the most facial details. The skin looks pale and grayish in places, and the foreground is quite dark. The sky, however, isn't blown out. Samsung has less detail loss in the face, but I also turned out quite dark on the photo, and the sky is completely overexposed. Here, we apparently have the lowest dynamic range. The X200 Ultra performed best, with a sufficiently bright foreground, a sky that isn't blown out, and excellent detail. The stabilization test showed confident results from all the smartphones, no complaints there. Now let's switch to 2x zoom and I'm recording everything around me. Vivo definitely has an advantage here. We're getting a very slight zoom from the main lens, while the competitors are doing a 2x crop. The X200 Ultra has the expected clarity and detail. For example, only with it can we read the text on the sign. Moreover, only with the Vivo do we see the building at the end of the road, whereas it's overexposed on both the left and right sides. However, overall, the Pura 80 Ultra also gives a very good result. The video is contrasty and quite clear. The grass and trees generally look almost the same as on the Vivo. Samsung had the weakest result at this zoom level. The video looks flat, the details are blurred, and for example, the texture of the asphalt is completely blurred. But interestingly, in the stabilization test, the S25 Ultra performed better than the others. The image on the competitors is more jittery and blurred than on the Samsung. Now on the smartphones, I'm enabling HDR and Dolby Vision. On the Vivo, it's Dolby Vision, on the Samsung, it's HDR. Unfortunately, on the Pura, we don't have those modes. Here's where things get most interesting, specifically, shooting against the light. Interestingly, the Huawei performed better than the S25 Ultra with HDR, even in standard shooting mode. The sky is a bit overexposed, like with Samsung, but the face is better lit. The foreground in the video on the right is too dark, but the X200 Ultra gave us the highest dynamic range. The foreground is quite bright and the sky isn't overexposed at all. When shooting in normal conditions, the video, generally, looks roughly the same as in standard dynamic range. And let's test logarithmic video recording right away. These are such raw videos that you can color grade yourself in post-production. Unfortunately, the Pura 80 Ultra doesn't have this mode either, so we can only evaluate the work of its competitors here. As you can see, Vivo and Samsung offer LOG recording even on the ultra-wide lenses. We use official LUTs from the companies to color grade the footage, and the results are before your eyes. The video looks decent. The sky in the background is visible well. Highlights aren't critical. At the same time, the foreground is also sufficiently lit. We get similar results with the main lens as well. Also, keep in mind that you can always adjust contrast, exposure, and other nuances when working with LOG. We're just showing the basic color grading in the result. By the way, both smartphones can also shoot with telephoto lenses in this mode. And now we're shooting a video portrait. On the Huawei, I have the aperture mode enabled, and a physical aperture is open at f1.6. On the Vivo X200 Ultra, I currently have the portrait video mode enabled, using the ultra-wide lens. And the Samsung S25 Ultra also has a portrait video mode, shooting in 4K at 30 frames per second. The blur is set to 5. Yes, friends, each smartphone has its own trick in this mode. Huawei allows for optical background blur, Vivo can shoot portraits even on the ultra-wide lens, and Samsung is the only one that records video with digital blur in 4K. But I can't say that the S25 Ultra significantly surpasses its competitors in terms of image quality here. Of course, the ultra-wide on the X200 Ultra delivers a slightly less sharp and detailed result, but the difference isn't that significant. All the videos look clear, and the detail is quite good. Regarding blur, I have the widest aperture, f1.6, set on the Huawei. On the Vivo, the digital blur is set to f2.8, and on the Samsung, the value is set to 5 on a scale of 1 to 7. The blur on the S25 Ultra and X200 Ultra is well controlled, even when I'm panning the camera. However, Huawei's optical blur advantage is definitely noticeable. It has the sharpest blur boundary and absolutely no issues with my bangs, whereas on the competitors, my bangs occasionally get pulled into the blur. Also, the difference in color reproduction is apparent again. But let's probably not dwell on that in detail again. Just look and choose which color you like best. Personally, my favorite so far is Samsung. I love its color reproduction, and in terms of stabilization, all three perform decently. Now I've activated the Pro mode on the Huawei. I'm shooting 4K at 60 frames per second with the main lens, aperture f1.6. On the Vivo X200 Ultra, I'm at 1.5x zoom using the main lens, and the blur is set to f2.8. This is the portrait video mode, and accordingly, on the Samsung S25 Ultra, I currently have portrait video mode set to 1x, and this is how the image looks when shooting in that mode. As soon as I started spinning around a bit, Vivo immediately showed a lot of blur, which of course isn't good. It's possible the problem is precisely that much zoom, making it harder to keep the face in focus while moving. Samsung remains unchanged, so there's not much to add to my previous comments. But Huawei, of course, is very pleasing. 4K 60 frames looks sharp and smooth, and it even has optical blur. Beautiful. But of course, the color reproduction slightly spoils the impression. The face looks particularly unpleasant when it's in shadow. It looks pale and grayish yellow again, But if you put color reproduction out of the equation, then I think the Pura 80 Ultra surpasses them all here. All three perform confidently in the stabilization test, so let's move on. Now on the Huawei Pura 80 Ultra, I'm setting the virtual aperture to f2.4. However, the image quality has dropped to Full HD at 30 frames per second. On the Vivo x200 Ultra, I'm using the main lens at 1.5x, and the Samsung S25 Ultra, it's again in portrait video mode, 4K at 30 frames per second. Digital blur on the Huawei works about the same as its competitors. And honestly, I wouldn't use it when we have 4K at 60 frames per second with optical stabilization, especially considering that the Huawei started to lose focus during the run. So, in terms of digital blur, it turned out to be the weakest of the three. In this mode, we're shooting the most challenging test, the tracking shot around a person. Huawei exhibits frame jitters during panning, while the competitors appear smooth. However, Vivo's ultra-wide significantly overexposed the video, causing my skin to appear almost white in sunlight, and the overall picture became flat. In this scenario, the S25 Ultra performed the most stably. Everything is smooth, even, and without color or brightness fluctuations. We're enabling optical blur in 4K at 60 frames per second on the S25 Ultra, and on the Vivo we're selecting the main lens. This time, all three videos look excellent and smooth. The only nuance I can point out is that Huawei shows larger and stronger lens flares at the beginning of video recording compared to its competitors. Let's test 8K video recording. Unfortunately, the new device doesn't have that option, unlike Vivo and Samsung. The X200 Ultra offers that resolution on the ultra-wide lens, while Samsung has it on all lenses. But honestly, there's not a noticeable difference between the Huawei and S25 Ultra footage. Furthermore, on the right we have very strong highlights and flares from the backlighting, which significantly degrade the impression of the video quality. However, the Vivo footage does look sharper and more detailed in 8K. Indeed, to see the difference, you need to watch the video in 4K, on a 4K monitor. Then you can notice that, for example, on this tile you can see more details that are lost to the left and right. The stabilization is holding up well on all the smartphones. They handle the movement confidently. When filming yourself, there's no significant difference in video either. I can only note that facial stubble is more visible on the Vivo and Samsung, while it's heavily blurred on the Huawei. The 80 Ultra and 200 Ultra handled the backlighting confidently. However, the Samsung shows quite a lot of overexposure in the sky. There are no questions about stabilization here either. All three worked well. Now we're switching to the main lenses. Samsung is the only one with 8K here, but again, you can't really see any difference from 4K with the naked eye. Generally, 8K is useful primarily from a practical standpoint. For example, if you're editing your videos and want to do it in 4K, then 8K video allows you to crop the image twice without losing quality. In the stabilization test, the S25 Ultra holds the smoothest, while the Vivo shows frame jitter, and the Huawei shows blurring. When shooting against the light, the Huawei's lens is hit by powerful sun flares, which aren't as strong with the competitors, but otherwise all three perform similarly. The stabilization is also excellent. All the videos are smooth, a pleasure to watch. Let's move on to the enhanced stabilization test. All three smartphones have this shooting capability on both the ultra-wide and the main lens. Let's start with the ultra-wide camera. First, we'll simulate shaking during active running, up and down. All three hold up pretty well here, but we can see there's smearing in the video everywhere, especially noticeable in the bokeh orbs. Now I'm shaking the smartphones from side to side. It's important to note here that the lateral phones have a greater range of rotational movement. Despite this, Samsung delivers excellent stabilization. Vivo performs worse, and Huawei is the weakest of the bunch. Although, it's worth noting that even it gradually stabilized and stopped shaking so much. Now let's move on to the main lenses. When shaken from top to bottom, or side to side, the S25 Ultra holds up best again. Definitely, Samsung has done an excellent job with stabilization. Well friends, we've arrived at the video zoom test. But first, let's check how smoothly the lens switching works on all the smartphones. Huawei is showing quite a jerky result. The transition from ultra-wide to 1x looks pretty good overall, but the stitching of the main camera with the telephoto lens already looks more abrupt and jagged. Whether it's a quick zoom or a smoother scroll, the smoothest transition is only seen when switching from one telephoto lens to another. Vivo's slow zoom also looks a bit jerky, but it's not as abrupt as on the 80 Ultra, and when you do a fast zoom, the seams are much less noticeable. Samsung has the smoothest transition from the ultra-wide to the main lens of all, but the switch from 1x to the first telephoto lens looks a bit harsh. The stitching between the two telephoto lenses is very smooth. Even when zooming in slowly, everything looks quite neat. But with fast zooms in and out, there's a noticeable jump from 1x to the telephoto lens and back. Now let's move on to the comparison of the video mode's zoom range. And of course, it's important to talk about the camera specs of our smartphones right away. Let's start with Huawei. The ultra-wide camera is 40 megapixel with an aperture of f2.2 and a focal length of 13 mm. The main module is 50 megapixels with a variable aperture of f1.6, f4.0. For zoom, they use two telephoto lenses. The first is 3.7x, 50 megapixels, f2.4. The second is 9.4x 12.5 megapixels f3.6. By the way, the telephoto lens here is unusual. Both lenses are housed in a single module, however they share the same sensor. And it's one of the largest on the market among all telephoto lenses, 1/1.28. This is an engineering achievement of Huawei themselves. No manufacturer had done anything like this before. Additionally, the 80 Ultra received a multispectral ultra chroma sensor. The ultra-wide camera on the Vivo is 50 megapixels with an aperture of f2.0 and a focal length of 14 millimeters. The main camera is also 50 megapixels but with an aperture of f1.69. And, of course, a telephoto lens with a 200 megapixel sensor, 3.7x zoom, and an aperture of f2.27. The Samsung S25 Ultra received almost the same cameras as the previous generation. The only new addition is the 50 megapixel ultra-wide lens with a 120-degree field of view. The main camera is 200 megapixels, the 3x telephoto is 10 megapixels, and the 5x periscope is 50 megapixels. Let's move on to practical tests. The images on the ultra-wides look extremely similar. The text on the signs is readable to roughly the same extent, and so far no significant differences are visible. Let's activate the main lenses. And here, the X200 Ultra does have a slight advantage due to the longer focal length, but overall, the video doesn't differ much in terms of detail. Moving on to the telephoto lenses. Vivo has the strongest lens among the competitors, and it's visible in various details. The tiles below are more detailed and sharper, and in the upper part of the frame, above the lights, the wall texture is excellently preserved. If we zoom in, for example, on the sign with the working hours, the difference with Huawei isn't as significant then. Therefore, of course, it's important to look at the whole picture. Samsung's video turned out to be the weakest. It has smudged details and unreadable text. You can also see chromatic aberration around the edges of objects. At 5x zoom, all models except the S25 Ultra use digital crop. I can't say that Samsung's second telephoto lens performed better at this level of magnification than the competitors. The details are about equally well rendered. The text is also readable in a similar fashion across all the videos. The Huawei uses hybrid zoom at 10x. The telephoto lens is engaged at 9.4x and a small digital crop is added. However, the result he gets is the weakest. The small text seems readable, but in the details you can see that it's the least well processed. Vivo performed better, but the clearest and most readable result is on the right, with Samsung. At 20x zoom, Huawei has the same story. From afar, the sign seems readable, but close up, there are noticeable dropouts in detail, and the small text just blends into what looks like hieroglyphs. The competitors also show distortions of the letters when zoomed in, but they still remain understandable and legible. Just out of curiosity, I switched from 60 FPS to 30, and the smartphones reacted differently. Huawei's smallest text became more readable. Vivo's, on the other hand, deteriorated, while the S25 Ultras remain almost unchanged. Now, I'm connecting 8K on the Vivo and Samsung. To be honest, there's practically no difference in the footage from the ultra-wide lens, except that the red patterns on the banner are more visible in 8K, but the text is read just as well in all videos. 1x 8K is only available on the S25 Ultra, but even here there are no significant differences visible. We can zoom in further on the Samsung since both telephoto lenses support 8K video. But at 5x and 10x, we have the same situation as we did when shooting in 4K, and ultimately we can say that 8K didn't give us any noticeable improvement in quality. Let's see how our smartphones record slow-motion video. Huawei's slow-mo is only available in Full HD and only on the main camera, while both other flagships offer 4K 120 FPS recording, even on the ultra-wide. And of course, the footage from Vivo and Samsung turns out to be higher quality and more interesting. All three devices can also shoot at 240 FPS in Full HD quality. Here, they all look more or less the same. I can only note that Vivo has better detailed elements due to its larger sensor size. For example, the walls in the background. Otherwise, the frames look quite similar. Now let's move on to macro video recording. This wonderful snail is posing for us on an apple. The new Huawei has dedicated a 3.7x telephoto lens for macro photography, as indicated by the camera interface during macro recording. Vivo also recommends using the telephoto lens for macro mode. On the Samsung, the enhanced focus mode is used for macro photography. When enabled, it provides a zoom range from ultra-wide to 10x. However, I would still advise using a maximum of 3x zoom in this mode, as the next level of magnification often loses focus. I shot roughly the same zoom levels on all three smartphones, and I think all three produced very good macro video. Now let's see how the smartphones handle time lapses. Huawei calls this time-lapse. Here we can set the zoom level from ultra-wide to 10x. On Vivo, to start a time-lapse, you need to go to the Landscape and Night section and click the timer icon in the bottom right corner. In this mode, we have access to shooting with all three lenses. Samsung, however, calls this mode hyperlapse, and we can also record it on all lenses from 0.6x to 5x. I'm noting that all three flagships allow you to record such videos in 4K, which is certainly very pleasing. I set the ultra-wide recording to automatic mode on all smartphones and start recording. On the Huawei, we can still see the image. Our screen didn't dim at all. It didn't turn off, like in time-lapse mode. On the Vivo, this display is very convenient. The battery charge is indicated as 60%. We're shown that recording is in progress, how many seconds of time-lapse have been recorded, and the total recording time. And, by the way, it's very clearly indicated to tap the screen to return to recording mode with the screen on. On the Samsung, the screen just dimmed a bit, but basically the information is visible. It says 24 seconds of time-lapse have been recorded. We've been recording for 12 minutes. And what do we get in the end? In my opinion, all three smartphones performed great and produced a fantastic picture. We've finished with the daytime video tests. Moving on to photos, we're starting as always with selfies. The first photo, and right away it's challenging conditions. I'm filming myself against the sun. The Huawei and Vivo seem to give very similar shots. Both try to highlight the face in the foreground in general, but there are noticeable differences in skin tone and overall color reproduction. The X200 Ultra also has the strongest highlights on the face of all the devices tested. The S25 Ultra, however, unlike its competitors, noticeably darkens the face. This was also the case in the front-facing camera video recording. I won't focus on that any further so as not to repeat myself, friends. Next photo. Here there's less light. Huawei gave the most washed-out result. The photo looks unpleasant. Vivo's skin tones are more lively, although they lean towards a slightly orange hue. Samsung's selfie is also washed out, and shadows have noise too. On the third selfie, the situation is essentially the same. Friends, write in the comments who, in your opinion, handled this test the best. Let's move on to portrait mode. In the very first photo, the 80 Ultra delivered the warmest and most saturated result, which made the skin look too red. Vivo and Samsung offer more natural and pleasing skin tones, with a slight difference in shades. As for blurring, all three smartphones performed well, but only Vivo managed to keep even the fine hairs of my bangs in focus, whereas they are blurred on the left and right. We're taking a second selfie with backlighting. With the Huawei, part of my face is obscured by a large glare, and the foreground is generally very dark. The S25 Ultra also produced a dark foreground and the most overexposed background, but it didn't have any glare on the face at all. But the Vivo actually impressed me and did a really good job. The face is illuminated, while the background isn't blown out, and there are fewer highlights on the face than on the Huawei. In selfie number 3, the sun isn't hitting the camera directly anymore. It's blocked by me. All three photos look decent, and there are no issues with the blur. Again, the only difference is in color reproduction, and that's already a matter of taste. Moving on, let's take photos of people using the main camera module. On close-up shots from ultra-wide to the main lens, the Vivo delivers the brightest and most saturated results, while the Huawei and Samsung photos look less expressive. The situation changes when we switch to the telephoto lens, where the photo on the left looks even brighter and more saturated than the Vivo shot. But at the same time, nothing much changed on the S25 Ultra. And in terms of color rendition, nothing changes. However, when it comes to detail, starting with 5x zoom, all the smartphones begin to subtly enhance the photos with algorithms, although the detail doesn't show a significant difference yet. At 10 times zoom, you can already see that Huawei and Vivo still provide a slightly clearer and more detailed result than Samsung. Let's look at another photo shoot for objectivity. On the ultra-wide lenses, all the photos look very similar, but it's noticeable that Vivo slightly overexposed the face and clothing. We see the same thing on the main lenses too, and almost on all the photos afterward. Vivo consistently gives us the brightest face with partial overexposure. Samsung handles bright light on the face a little better, but Huawei performs most confidently in this regard. It doesn't have any blown-out areas on faces or clothing in any of the close-ups. As for sharpness and detail, there's not much difference between the photos on distant and medium close-ups. However, at 10x zoom, for example, you can already see that Samsung is losing sharpness and producing glow along the edges of the face. But the differences are most noticeable at 30x zoom. The Pura 80 Ultra produced the sharpest and clearest image. The Vivo X200 Ultra has weaker detail. The photo looks softer. Some of the fine details have been smoothed out by algorithms and appear blurry. Finally, the S25 Ultra delivers the weakest result. I'd also like to point out that both Vivo and Samsung show noticeable blooming around the contours of the face. The algorithm draws in the contours, which results in a bright halo appearing. Huawei doesn't have this effect, so the photo looks cleaner. Now let's switch to portrait mode. The first photo shoot is of my wonderful daughters. At the first zoom level 1x, there's no visible difference in blur. Everyone handled it well, the only difference is in color reproduction. Next, 2x zoom on the Huawei and Samsung, and 2.2x zoom on the Vivo. The blur effect is roughly the same on all photos here. But if you really scrutinize the details, you can see that the Samsung didn't handle the finer hair as well as the others. Switching to telephoto lenses, the Pura 80 Ultra seemed to soften the focus on my older daughter. The face looks overly smooth and lacks sharpness. At the same time, we can see that her hair is partially in focus, while other parts are blurred. Samsung doesn't seem to have any focus issues, but the photo itself turned out a bit dark, and there's noticeable graininess on the face. Vivo, however, delivered an excellent quality result with clear faces, good detail, and a pleasing bokeh effect. We switched to 5.6x on the Huawei, 5.9x on the Vivo, and 5x on the Samsung. My eldest daughter's face was already out of focus in the X200 Ultra shot. But with the Huawei, this time everything is fine, although it's noticeable that it excessively smooths skin. This kind of processing won't appeal to everyone. Samsung retained more detail, but it's noticeable that it handled the blur boundary more harshly. We can also take a portrait photo with 10x zoom on the Pura 80 Ultra, and the shot turned out excellent. High quality, natural color, neat, well-defined bokeh. Even fine, individual hairs are in focus. Now let's see how the flagships handle a more complex photo shoot. There are already 4 people in the frame. At low zoom levels 1x, we get a result similar to what we already saw in the first photo shoot. All the smartphones handle blur pretty well, and we, as a group, stayed in focus. However, I note that Samsung had some difficulty with my daughter's hair at 2x zoom, but the photos from the TVs surprised me. At 5x zoom, the Samsung S25 Ultra seemed to try to focus on the background, and it completely blurred me and my daughter. With Huawei, something strange happened with Mia's hair. To the right, above the head, they are partially blurred, which makes it look like some of the hair is just floating in the air, separate from the rest of the hairstyle. Vivo probably handled this the neatest of all. Another photo with the same zoom level, and here the focus is all correct. But the blur boundary still looks noticeable. The X200 Ultra has the neatest result. On the right side of my daughter Masha's stripes, we see a sharp area that replicates the outline of her hairstyle with the Huawei. With the Samsung, the blurring boundary generally looks rough, and there are artifacts noticeable in the hair. Let's move on to shooting the surroundings. We're starting with the ultra-wide lenses. It's interesting to see how the autofocus works here. For this, we're taking photos from a low angle. It's noticeable that all 3 introduce a slight blur in the foreground, while the rest of the frame remains in focus. Otherwise, the photos are quite similar, with differences mainly in color reproduction. Now let's look at the photos taken with the main lens. Here too, all the differences boil down to color reproduction. I would say that all the photos here look interesting. Let's see how the telephoto lenses perform. All 3 smartphones generally produce good shots here too. But what I note about the first photo with the trees is that the Huawei and Vivo telephoto lenses provided a pleasing optical background blur, whereas there's nothing like that on the S25 Ultra. The other photos are very similar, so the choice depends on your preference for color reproduction. Now we're doing our classic fork and spoon test. Let's see how the smartphone handles fine details in portrait mode. When shooting with the main lens, all 3 failed the test immediately. The fork is blurry in each of the 3 shots, but at least Vivo still retained the outline of a utensil. The others, however, have made a real wireless fork out of their photos. At 2x zoom, the situation is, as you can see, similar, and only Vivo manages the task acceptably. Let's engage the telephoto lenses and we see that the situation has improved for everyone. However, Huawei still has a very noticeable blur in part of the image. And the pasta is also blurry in both the Huawei and Vivo photos. The S25 Ultra performed best here. Next, 5.6x zoom on the Huawei, 5.9x on the Vivo, and 5x on the Samsung. The X200 Ultra handled it flawlessly. The Pura 80 Ultra has a slightly blurry pasta shape, and Samsung unfortunately didn't handle it at all here. Let's see how the smartphones perform with the thin straw. And here, on the initial close-up shots, all 3 did a great job. But at 5.9x and 5x zoom, the Vivo and Samsung already struggled with the test. Meanwhile, the Huawei handled it fine with 5.6x zoom. Now we're setting up a delicious photo shoot to see how the smartphones cope with food photography. Samsung and Vivo have a special mode for these photos, but they are very limited. The X200 Ultra only gives us 2 zoom levels for close-up shots. The S25 Ultra offers just 3. Huawei, on the other hand, doesn't have a separate food mode, and I'm using the aperture mode for this test. Let's see what we get in practice. And in my opinion, all the photos turn out delicious and pleasing. Interestingly, to get more flexibility in photos with the Vivo and Samsung, you can exit the food mode and take regular photos, for example using the telephoto lenses. You won't notice much difference in terms of quality or color reproduction, but you'll have more flexibility in angles and close-ups. Now let's move on to the macro photography test. Here, of course, all the shots turn out to be truly impressive. However, the competitors still don't quite reach the level of the Vivo X200 Ultra. A 200-megapixel telephoto lens, that's power, friends. Just look at it. You can even make out the tiny hairs on the legs of the ants. With Huawei, we see very strong smoothing of photos using algorithms. Why does it look so artificial? Samsung heavily processes the photos, but the result is also the least sharp. Now let's evaluate the zoom capabilities of the smartphones in photo mode. We'll start with the ultra-wide, and here I can say that the level of detail is extremely similar, and those same signs are readable in roughly the same way. The same story applies to the main lens. We're enabling 2x zoom on the Huawei with Samsung and 2.2x on the Vivo. The X200 Ultra performed the best here. Its small text is more legible than that of its rivals. Let's see how the telephoto lenses handle it. 3.7x on the Pura 80 Ultra and X200 Ultra. The results were quite similar. Samsung struggled with 3x and it produced quite a lot of noise, while our competitors' photos were clean. At the same time, all the flagship phones performed roughly the same at 5x zoom. Now let's move on to 4x on the Vivo X200 Ultra, and here he of course wins in terms of detail and clarity thanks to a more powerful zoom. At 10x zoom, the results are roughly the same for all flagship phones. Perhaps only Samsung's text looks slightly less detailed than the others. At 30x zoom, all smartphones are actively adding details, and I think Vivo X200 Ultra handled this best. Here the flower room text is more legible than on competitors' devices. Huawei actually turned some of the letters into hieroglyphs. And on the Samsung, they simply look less clear and detailed. The Vivo has a maximum zoom of 105x. Huawei and Samsung offer 100x. It's the same story here. Vivo's algorithms handle refining details and text the best, and the sign is more readable than on competitors' devices. Let's move on to shooting raw photos. These images aren't processed by the smartphone's algorithms, but are saved in their original form directly from the camera sensor. The most revealing photos in this format are those taken in challenging conditions. For example, images like these with backlighting. I can confidently say that all three smartphones performed excellently here, even considering that it's an ultra-wide lens. The sky looks great, the clouds aren't overexposed, and there aren't any strong flares around the sun. The photo also looks good on the main lens of all three smartphones. We're going to see how the smartphone performs in this mode at night. Let's move on to the continuous shooting test. Unfortunately, I couldn't find this option on the Huawei. Although on the official website they claim the presence of burst shooting, which is essentially continuous shooting. If you know, friends, where the continuous shooting is hidden on the Pura 80 Ultra, please write it in the comments. I'm reading everything. For now, we had to take quick photos manually. With Vivo and Samsung, you need to press and hold the shutter button and pull it down for that kind of shooting. Both allow us to take up to 100 frames at once. Let's see how clear results we can get here. Here, the S25 Ultra performed the worst, blurring the racket in many shots. Now we're testing instant photo, a photo that should capture even the fastest movement in the frame. A badminton tournament. The ideal option for this test. At the very first photo, all three smartphones clearly caught the shuttlecock in focus as it flew by. Of course, the photo quality at that zoom level is a bit weak, especially on the S25 Ultra. But we're focusing on autofocus during rapid movements right now. In the second shot, the shuttlecock is only in focus on the Vivo. It's a bit blurry on the Huawei, and you can see for yourself on the right. Overall, of course, Huawei and Vivo delivered more confident results than the S25 Ultra. Let's talk about the camera features of our flagships. The Pura 80 Ultra offers quite a number of filters for photo and video recording, both for portraits and landscapes. Vivo's standout features include portrait mode, which has a lot of flexible settings. You can smooth skin, adjust makeup, change skin tone, and so on. I've talked about all of these options in detail in our Vivo camera setup guide, by the way. There's a lot of useful information for all owners of this smartphone there. The link will be in the description, friends. And we also have different styles here. These are essentially the same filters. But what sets Vivo smartphones apart from others is the presence of pre-made presets for portrait photos. There are quite a few of them. Focal lengths are indicated directly, and icons at the bottom show what the final result will look like. It's clear and convenient. Let's move on to the S25 Ultra. It also offers us a lot of color correction filters for photos and videos, but one of the most important features, which isn't often found in other smartphones, is the ability to separate the foreground from the background. We have several presets here, including black and white and color options. You can get quite unusual shots in this mode. Friends, night has fallen, and now we'll test the photo and video capabilities in low light and artificial lighting conditions. As always, our first test is 4K at 30 FPS on the front cameras of our smartphones. It's quite dark here, so I'm setting it to 30 FPS. If it were brighter, I would have set it to 60 FPS. But there's basically just one lamp here. It illuminates my face. And here's the kind of image these smartphones produce. With sufficient light from lamps in the frame, all three videos look acceptable. Although, of course, I always say that you shouldn't shoot video with the front-facing camera in low light. Never. These cameras haven't reached that level yet. As for the differences, the main one is in skin tone and overall color reproduction. Huawei and Samsung have a pinkish skin tone, while Vivo tends to yellow quite a bit. In terms of image quality and normal lighting, the Pura 80 Ultra is better. The hair, facial details, and stubble are more refined than those of its competitors. But as soon as you step into the shadows, the image degrades equally for everyone. And the face illumination on the Huawei doesn't save the situation. Generally, Huawei has significantly improved the front-facing camera compared to the previous generation of Pura 70 Ultra. We actually did a detailed comparison of these two smartphones recently. If you're interested, friends, there's a link in the description. As for stabilization, it's noticeable that even when walking, the video comes out blurry. And if I try to run, the situation only gets worse. This is what the front-facing camera recording looks like in 4K at 60 FPS. Well, the Vivo is just depressing. Samsung and Huawei are more or less okay. Switching to 60 FPS, Vivo performed the worst of all. Samsung felt a little more confident, but once again, Huawei delivered the most normal-looking image. In portrait mode, we have a situation that's generally the same as in regular shooting. If there's a light source nearby, the picture on all the smartphones is more or less normal, but when it gets dark, the quality drops. Regarding blur, the X200 Ultra and Samsung S25 Ultra hold up surprisingly well even in these conditions. However, as soon as I start rotating the camera, we see jerks with the Vivo, just as we saw in the daytime tests. Let's switch to the main camera setup and record everything around us with the ultra-wide lens. Let's evaluate the image quality, pausing the video and examining the still frames. Vivo and Huawei have quite similar detail levels. The sidewalk and grass are rendered about the same, whereas the S25 Ultra's details are blurred. I'm also noting that the X200 Ultra has the smallest amount of flare from headlights. But in motion, the video from Vivo looks choppy, as if there's frame loss. Although we checked, and the original file does indeed have 30 FPS. It feels like 20-25 frames per second, and the problem wasn't during editing. This is what the original files actually look like. We checked. What's interesting is that the X200 Ultra handled the stabilization test the best. It has the clearest image while the video on either side gets heavily blurred with each zoom level. But it's important to remember that Vivo is centered on the tripod, while Huawei and Samsung are on the edges. It might be the reason. When shooting selfies, the results are quite blurry. Facial details and hair are poorly rendered. The texture of the sweater is sometimes visible, sometimes not. I won't discuss color rendition here as the same skin tones change depending on the lighting. Stabilization worked as well as it did when filming the entire surroundings. Again, Vivo has virtually no blur, unlike its competitors. But again, it's most likely due to the positioning of the smartphones on the tripod. I also filmed in 60 FPS. And of course, the video looks smoother. Vivo, in particular, no longer exhibits dropped frames. However, in terms of image quality, no significant changes are noticeable. However, the stabilization has definitely improved. Now all three videos look smoother, and motion blur is considerably reduced. When filming yourself, the main difference from 30 FPS is the smoothness of the image. As for facial details, clothing, and other nuances, there are no changes there. The video didn't get better, but it didn't get worse either. Stabilization has also improved. There's no blurry footage, no shakiness either. The conclusion practically speaks for itself. 60 frames per second on the ultra-wide and low light is a usable shooting mode for all three of these smartphones. We don't lose much in quality, but we gain smoothness and good stabilization. Switching to the main camera and shooting everything around us again. Again, the Vivo video looks shaky and vibrates almost with every step. That's strange. It's difficult to specifically assess the image quality while moving. I'll discuss that when filming myself. The stabilization test showed that Huawei and Samsung performed well, with no blur and a fairly smooth image. However, the X200 Ultra's image appears more shaky. For fun, I tested the stabilization while climbing stairs. Here, all three smartphones perform smoothly and neatly. However, switching to 60 FPS didn't give us any advantage. Quite the opposite. For example, with Vivo, the shake while running became more noticeable and there's a blur. All three videos look decent when filming yourself. My face and hair are rendered well, and the texture of the clothes is clearly visible. But as soon as I started moving the camera, the X200 Ultra's issue with jerky footage reappeared. The competition doesn't have this problem. The videos look smooth, all three handled the running test confidently. But Vivo shows noticeable jolts again. It's as if there's a loss of frames. And this is what the recording with background blur looks like. On the Huawei, I have aperture mode enabled. f2.4 blur. On the Vivo X200 Ultra, I have portrait video mode enabled. And on the Samsung S25 Ultra, it's the 1x lens with portrait video mode at 4K 30 FPS. Even though 4K is exclusive to Samsung, I can't say that the other competitors are significantly lacking in image quality. And the background blur also holds up well across the board, especially considering the shooting conditions. On the Huawei, I switched to Pro mode and set the aperture to f1.6. The actual physical aperture, filming at 4K 60 FPS. There's plenty of light. On the Vivo, I'm using the 1.5x lens. I think only my face will be in frame. Now on the Samsung, it's the 1x lens, 4K 30 FPS. Portrait video mode with background blur, meaning it blurs the background. It's a video portrait. Of course, Huawei looks the best here. It has the optimal frame size. 4K video at 60 frames per second and optical blur, which of course wins over digital in any scenario. The result is the smoothest video with the sharpest foreground. And generally, you don't need to worry about parts of the face or hair being blurred. Now let's see how the smartphones handled a tracking shot around a person in low light. Let's see how the smartphones perform in video zoom under these conditions. Generally, all three videos look similar on the ultra-wide lenses. But let's zoom in on the details. For example, the grass and the tiles are best detailed on the X200 Ultra. On the Huawei, in the Silm area, the tile pattern isn't as sharp and the grass is blurry. And Samsung has a similar situation. Let's switch to the main lenses. The Pura 80 Ultra performed better in the details. Its text has the least overexposure and is more readable than on the competitors. There's slightly more overexposure on the text with the Vivo. However, it produced the noisiest result with a bit of shaking. The S25 Ultra has the most overexposure around the letters, but the video is more stable and less noisy than the X200 Ultras. Let's activate the telephoto lenses. It's striking how much Huawei reduced the exposure. On the one hand, it's good, there's no overexposure on the signs. The text is perfectly readable. On the other hand, it's just too dark. Vivo's video is quite noisy, the sign is overexposed, but still readable. The telephoto lens on the S25 Ultra is the noisiest, and the text is practically unreadable. Let's move to 5x zoom. Same picture again. The Pura 80 Ultra reduces exposure, the video is very dark. But there are no blown-out highlights, and there's also no noise. And the text is perfectly readable. But Vivo and Samsung have the same results as they do with the telephoto lenses. Now, 10x. The main difference here is in how the noise reduction works. We see how aggressively Huawei removes noise, but in the process, it heavily smooths out the details. Almost no traces of the tile joints remain on the building, which we can see on the Vivo and Samsung devices. On the other hand, their images are noisier. Which is better is a complex question. A similar situation occurs at the 20x zoom level. The text is clearly readable on the left. The image is the least noisy, but heavily smoothed. There's a lot of noise in the center. The sign is quite overexposed. To the right, there's slightly less noise than on the Vivo, but the color distortions are very noticeable. Interestingly, Samsung's sign looks the best. We can even make out the words coffee and pizza. And now, here's how that zone detail looks at 60 frames per second. There aren't many changes, except that the Vivo's image has become paler, and the S25 Ultra shows more noise. I tested the zoom at 8K, but right away on the ultra-wide lens, I can say that the difference from 4K isn't visible. With Vivo, for example, the tiles were already more detailed than those of the competitors. At the same location, details on the Samsung look just as blurry as they do in 4K. And on the following close-ups, the S25 Ultra's 8K video doesn't improve the detail either. We're done with the video recording tests. Let's move on to photos. I'm taking the first photo with my daughter. I'm noting right away that the Pura 80 Ultra added green tints to the photos, as there's a green source nearby. However, our competitors don't have this issue. Huawei also has the most lens flare, but there are also some positive aspects. The Selfie looks the sharpest and most detailed. At the same time, Vivo's detail rendering is weaker, and a lot of noise appeared, especially in the sky. Samsung's photo turned out blurry. I could say I just shook the camera here, but the next photo looks just as soapy. It feels like the S25 Ultra lost focus. Vivo's shot is noisy again. Huawei, on the other hand, actively clones photos of noise. The result looks more pleasing because of this. However, it clearly lacks contrast, and the Selfie appears flatter than that of its competitors. Let's move on to portrait selfies. And once again, my lovely daughter Mia is helping me. In the shot with Huawei, her face is out of focus. And we see strong green flare again here. Such a photo is definitely a dud. Vivo and Samsung have focus working fine. The blur also worked nicely. Here, the only difference is in color reproduction. Choose whichever you prefer. Second photo. Here, again, the Pura 80 Ultra blurred my daughter's face. A strange situation. Vivo and Samsung are once again fine with the focus. And the blur worked well again, without any glaring flaws. When shooting against the light with flashlights, the front camera on the 80 Ultra performed poorly and overexposed the image. As a result, the photo looks as if the camera has fogged up, or as if film has been overlaid on top. The S25 Ultra produced a very noisy and darkest result, and also didn't handle hair very well. The most confident results in the center. The edge of the blur is neat, hair in focus, a well-lit face with a natural tone, and the overall result is a pleasant composition. Here's the last photo. Now in simpler conditions. All the smartphones handled this without problems here. There are some minor imperfections with the hair. with the beard, but that's just nitpicking. The main difference again comes down to color reproduction. Now let's take a photo of a person using the main camera module. Starting with the ultra-wide lens. All three photos look interesting here. Huawei and Vivo's images are more saturated and tweaked. Samsung's colors are closer to natural, calmer, and thanks to this, its night sky looks genuinely black. The main lens shows a similar story, but here the sky appears almost black, just like on the Samsung. At the same time, Vivo produced the most saturated skin tone, while Huawei and S25 Ultra have a more neutral skin tone. Interestingly, the cutouts on the building are red best in the center. They're visible less well on the left, and completely overexposed on the right. Let's engage the telephoto lenses. Huawei Vivo delivers excellent results with these lenses. The photo looks sharp, the skin tones are pleasing, and the optical background blur adds depth to the frame. The S25 Ultra shots against this background look uncertain, noisy, dark, and washed out. We get similar results at 5x zoom. I can only note here that Huawei smooths the face more aggressively, while Vivo makes it sharper. The smoothing on the 80 Ultra is even more noticeable at 10x. Because of how the algorithms work, the stubble on my face looks like it was drawn with black marker strokes. Vivo delivers a more reasonable result here, while Samsung fell apart on the first telephoto lens, so there's not much to say about it. 30x, the maximum zoom. Again, Huawei exhibits strong smoothing, Vivo produces a sharper but rougher photo, and Samsung is just disappointing. Now let's try taking a photo of a person in night mode. These photos are taken with a short exposure time and in theory could offer higher quality in low light conditions. The results on the ultra-wide lens were quite varied. The Huawei shot is bluish and very saturated, with the greenest greens. On the other hand, it heavily blurred the trees to the right, or for example the houses in the background. Our competitors don't have any flaws. Vivo's photos have a yellowish tint, but overall they look good. Sharp, detailed, crisp. The S25 Ultra seems to have produced a blurry image. The snapshot looks soft, and it's also quite dark and pale. Let's engage the main lenses, and here we notice a very beautiful but very unnatural moon in the Vivo photo. And that's all because the landscape and night mode are activated here. Overall, the photo is good, the brightest of all. But I'm noticing the strongest lens flares from the streetlight on the left. Huawei has really nailed the tree on the right this time, and it's also very well lit, as is the entire background. The photo is very saturated and contrasty, it looks interesting. This blue-green color rendition isn't for everyone. And the highlights on the left are poking out too. But Samsung has absolutely no highlights from the headlights, and it again delivers the most neutral and darkest result. Let's activate the telephoto lenses. Huawei's result is bluish again, but overall it's high quality. The photo is bright, sharp, saturated, with a pleasant background blur. The Vivo has some kind of resonance. We can clearly see optical background blur. And the moon is in focus. It looks like a simply overlaid image. Otherwise, the shot is also decent. Samsung is faltering again here, and of course it loses in this shooting compared to its competitors. I won't repeat myself at 5x zoom, the results are exactly the same there. But at 10x something did change. Huawei made my face extremely pale here. It's a problem that occurs quite often, and naturally I find that skin tone unpleasant. Let's take portrait shots in low light conditions. The photos look pleasing on the main lens of the Pura 80 Ultra. The face is well lit, the details of the hair and clothing are good, but there are inaccuracies visible along the edge of the blur. It's clear that the algorithms struggle with my daughter's hair. The Vivo x200 Ultra produces the brightest image, and thanks to the 75mm focal length, the portrait detailing is very detailed. We can even see the texture of the sweater fabric. The background blur is neat, and the boundary is softer and more precise than in the photo on the left. The S25 Ultra photo is dark and noisy, but at least the blur worked well. Let's switch to the next zoom level. The Huawei photo turned out very pale, and again, problems with hair blur are noticeable, especially with thin strands. It looks strange. Some of the hair is blurry, some is out of focus and looks bad. The Vivo has a soft blur, and the photo as a whole turned out the most neat and pleasing. Bright, warm, saturated with careful hair detail. The S25 Ultra loses to its Chinese competitors again. The photo is very noisy and grainy. Let's enable the telephoto lenses. The Pura 80 Ultra handled the hair better at this level of detail, and the overall shot turned out quite bright and warm. Interestingly, at this level of detail, the skin tone on the Vivo was less saturated than on the Huawei. The face looks a little blurred, but it's possibly just a bad take. Samsung's photos are consistently dark and noisy, and the blur effect doesn't look very good here either. Harsh clipo and artifacts are noticeable. This is the last close-up. The photo from the 80 Ultra already came out a little blurred. There are no issues with skin tone or blurs. In this respect, the photo is good. Vivo produces the brightest portrait, actively brightening the face as always. The S25 Ultra produces a darker and somewhat noisier result, as it has done previously. Friends, we didn't have time to capture nighttime landscape photos this time, but we showed them in our previous videos about these smartphones. On just saying that the 80 Ultra definitely started shooting better than its predecessor, which we showed in our comprehensive comparison. And now we're moving on to the low-light zoom test. On the ultra-wide lens, we immediately see that the smartphones handle bright signs differently. For example, here the Samsung and Huawei produced a very overexposed text, while the Vivo had no overexposure at all, and the text is read better. In photos taken with the Moan lens, the X200 Ultra performs better again with artificial lighting. For example, this highlighted text is the sharpest and has no overexposure. The text in the Huawei is also not overly exposed, but it is less sharp, a little blurry. And the S25 Ultra has the most overexposure of all. By the way, for comparison, we're taking photos at 12 megapixels because the 200 megapixel shots had much stronger overexposure. We're zooming in at 2.2x on the X200 Ultra and at 2x on the other smartphones. The situation here is interesting. The Huawei text is readable, but it aggressively suppresses noise. This is immediately noticeable. Vivo's display turned into a red stripe, the text is completely unreadable. Samsung gave the noisiest result, but you can still make out the writing. Let's enable the telephoto lenses, and here the results are interesting. With Huawei, you can read the sign and even see the logo, but the background tiles are heavily blurred. Vivo's result is more overexposed, but the tile detail is the best. Samsung's logo is completely pop out and there's the most noise, and the tile is completely invisible. However, the Rostix text is more legible than on the others. At 5x zoom, the left and center areas are essentially equal. But unfortunately, nothing has changed with Samsung. On the Vivo, I enable 7.4x zoom, and the result is the same as on the Samsung. The logo is completely blown out. At 10x zoom, we try to read the address plate on the building, but alas, we can only make out the number. You can see that Huawei's algorithms are working more powerfully than even Vivo's, and because of that, the plate looks clearer and more detailed. Vivo's result is similar, but not as processed, and zooms less sharp. Samsung's is very noisy and blurry. 30x. Here, you can actually make out the street name on the photo on the right. The S25 Ultra did a decent job too. There's a lot of noise, but the letters are discernible. But I can't say that about Vivo. Even the approximate silhouettes of the letters were blurred. The situation is similar at the maximum zoom level. It seems Vivo just lost its crown for photo zoom. Friends, what do you think? Let's move on to long exposure photography. The Pura 80 Ultra offers a light mode for this kind of shooting, which you can find in the More tab. We see 4 presets for long exposure photography here. In our case, it's better to use the light graffiti option. Vivo calls long exposure exactly that. It's located in landscape and night mode. There are more presets here than on Huawei. You can choose whichever you like for your desired scenario. Samsung doesn't have a long exposure feature in the standard camera app at all. For this, you need to install Expert RAW and then take the photo through it. You'll have to set all the settings manually. I must say it's not as convenient as it is with the Chinese competitors. Let's look at the results. Overall, all 3 photos look good, but the S25 Ultra photo is the most overexposed, which made the sky the brightest and the lights the most blown out. Let's now try taking pictures of the moon. On the main lens, we're only seeing silhouettes of the moon right now. Let's switch to a larger zoom. 10x. Here the moon started to appear on the Huawei, while it's still overexposed on the Vivo and Samsung. At 30 times zoom, all 3 handled it well. The shots look great, but the Pura 80 Ultra still wins in detail. We see the same thing at the next zoom level. The photo on the left is the most detailed and sharp. Maximum zoom, same thing. Huawei delivers the most detailed moon again. Vivo has noticeably fewer details, and Samsung's, frankly, is the weakest shot of the 3. Now let's take a look at photos of the night sky. On Huawei and Vivo, you can take these photos in landscape and night modes respectively. For Samsung, these shots need to be taken once again through Expert RAW. Of course, Chinese smartphones are more straightforward and convenient for these kinds of scenarios, and yet the results are good. It's difficult for Samsung to achieve something similar. You need to experiment with the settings for a long time, but even then, no one guarantees you're going to get good pictures. Our last street test for today is nighttime RAW photos. Right away, starting with the ultra-wide, the new Huawei shows very strong noise. Of course, you can remove it using digital noise reduction in Lightroom, but then what's the point of shooting RAW and fussing with Editable if the phone itself can remove that noise in regular photo mode? The Samsung performs better on the ultra-wide. Here at least, there's no such graininess. But in terms of dynamic range, Vivo still leads. We managed to color its photos more flexibly and get more interesting results. We see the same thing in photos from the Moan cameras. Even during sunset, when it's not yet fully dark, Huawei produces quite noisy images. And Vivo, again, delivers the widest dynamic range on all the photos. It allows you to achieve really great results, reducing highlights while not blowing out the shadows. The situation remains almost the same with the telephoto lenses. Yes, Huawei has reduced noise, but it's still noticeable in some photos. Samsung and Vivo look more impressive in this regard. The S25 Ultra doesn't always manage to pull out the bright areas like in this photo with the store. But overall, the telephoto lens here can compete with the results of the X200 Ultra. Let's see how our smartphones hold up in terms of battery life after all the tests. Each shooting day, we started with 100% battery charge for all the flagships. By the evening of the first day, Huawei had 54% remaining, Vivo had 57%, and Samsung had 54%. On the second day, the new device drained to 8%, the X200 Ultra had 28% left, and the S25 Ultra had 12%. Of course, Vivo is unrivaled in terms of battery life. As for the specifications, the Huawei Pura 80 Ultra is equipped with a 5170 mAh lithium polymer battery. The smartphone supports 100-watt wired charging, 80-watt wireless charging, and 4.5-watt reverse charging. The Vivo X200 Ultra has a silicon carbon battery with a capacity of 6000 mAh. It supports 90-watt wired charging, 40-watt wireless charging, and reverse charging at the same 4.5 watts. The S25 Ultra received a classic lithium-ion battery with a capacity of 5000 mAh. It supports 45-watt wired fast charging, 15-watt wireless charging, and reverse charging at 4.5 watt. Well, let's move on to our studio tests. Let's start by measuring PWM and peak brightness on our smartphones, and we'll go through the parameters right away. The Huawei Pura 80 Ultra features a 6.8-inch OLED display with a resolution of 2848 by 1276 pixels. The Vivo X200 Ultra has a 6.82-inch AMOLED screen and a resolution of 3168 by 1440 pixels. The Samsung S25 Ultra received a dynamic AMOLED 2X display with a 6.9-inch diagonal and a resolution of 3120 by 1440 pixels. All three have an adaptive refresh rate from 1 to 120 Hz. Now let's check for screen flicker. At 100% brightness, the Huawei Pura 80 Ultra shows about 10%. The Vivo X200 Ultra displays roughly 12%. The Samsung S25 Ultra registers a noticeably higher value, up to 31%. When reducing brightness to half, the numbers don't change dramatically. With Huawei, we observe up to 10% PWM. Vivo shows around 8.5%. Samsung goes up to 29%. Now we decrease brightness to the minimum. Huawei results in about 11% PWM. Vivo shows approximately 3.7%. Samsung has the strongest flicker, up to 58%. So, if you're sensitive to screen flicker, it's best to avoid Samsung. Let's move on to performance tests of our smartphones. What are the specs? The Huawei flagship runs on its own high-silicon Kirin 9020 processor. The graphics are handled by the proprietary Melun 920 video chip, optimized for the Huawei ecosystem. The Vivo X200 Ultra and Samsung S25 Ultra, however, are equipped with top-of-the-line Qualcomm Snapdragon 8 Elite processors. Both flagships use the Adreno 830 GPU, which provides high performance in games and fast photo and video processing. Let's see the differences in practice. In Antutu, the Vivo X200 Ultra performed the fastest, finished the test first, and scored over 2 million points. Samsung S25 Ultra came in second. The result exceeded 3 million points. The Huawei Pura 80 Ultra came last with a final score of just over 1 million. The situation repeated itself in the Geekbench processor test. Vivo finished the measurement first again with a score of 3,000 at 22 points and 9,322 points in the single-core test. In the multi-core measurement, Samsung was again in second place, with such results in terms of speed, 2,754 and 9,456 points respectively. And finally, the test concluded again with Huawei, and its results are the weakest, 1,260 and 4,275 points. Now we'll check the stability of the smartphones. A stress test, Wildlife Extreme from 3D Mark. The results of the test show that the Huawei Pura 80 Ultra has the most modest score. The best cycle, 1,599 points. The worst, 1,574. But the stability is impressive, 98.4%. The Vivo X200 Ultra demonstrated a significantly higher level of power, 6,865 points in the best cycle and 3,458 in the worst. However, its stability was only 50.4%. The Samsung S25 Ultra's results are similar to the Vivo's, 6,915 and 3,334 points. But its stability is even lower, at just 48.2%. So, it turns out that Huawei exhibits the most stable performance under load, but also the lowest level of performance. Vivo and Samsung, on the other hand, deliver a high score in terms of power, but their stability is noticeably weaker. And here, a few words are important to say about heating. During the 3D Mark test, the Huawei Pura 80 Ultra heated up to over 43.5 degrees Celsius. The Vivo X200 Ultra's temperature rose to almost 49 degrees Celsius. That's the hottest result among the three. The Samsung S25 Ultra, however, turned out to be the least heated, just slightly above 38 degrees Celsius at peak. Now let's run some network speed tests. We'll check both Wi-Fi and data transfer via a standard SIM card. We'll perform the standard benchmark using NPerf. We're using the same server. The Huawei Pura 80 Ultra shows up to 530 megabit per second on download and around 360 megabit per second on upload. The Vivo X200 Ultra is a bit slower on download, up to 494 megabit per second, but wins on upload with almost 387 megabit per second. The Samsung S25 Ultra achieved a maximum download speed of 473 megabit per second and an upload speed of 383 megabit per second. In the mobile internet speed test, the Huawei Pura 80 Ultra showed the best result, 154 and 36 megabit per second respectively. Samsung S25 Ultra slightly lost with results of 134 and 34 megabit per second. The Vivo X200 Ultra delivered the lowest speed, around 90 and 18 megabit per second. Well friends, let's summarize. I pre-ordered this Huawei Pura 80 Ultra smartphone, and with all the discounts, it cost me around $1,510. At the same time, Huawei always pleases and includes a case and a charger, a whopping 100 watt, which is very nice. As a gift, I also received these awesome Huawei Watch GT5 Pro smartwatches, some of the best out there. And my absolute favorite earbuds, which I use constantly, are the Huawei Free Clips. All things considered, with all of this 512GB smartphone cost me around $1,140. Competitors like Samsung and Vivo were selling their smartphones at a higher price at launch. Now the Pura 80 Ultra can be found for a price starting at around $1,020. The Vivo X200 Ultra will cost a little less, starting at about $960. And the Samsung S25 Ultra costs from around $985. Let's start with the newcomer. This is a very powerful update compared to the Pura 70 Ultra, and the first plus, of course, is the new, super impressive telephoto lens. Comes with two lenses right away. Before shooting this video, the Vivo X200 Ultra definitively gave the best results in low-light conditions at maximum zoom. But in my test, the Huawei Pura 80 Ultra showed itself to be even better. Next, a really great plus. It's the main lens with the variable aperture. It allows you to adjust the background optical blur and get video in 4K 60 FPS with optical blur. It looks great, both in daylight and in low light. No other smartphone currently offers this feature. Video from the main camera module looks decent in daylight and is acceptable in low light. What other plus could I mention about the new Huawei Pura 80 Ultra? It has really excellent stabilization across almost all focal lengths. If the main lens didn't stabilize the image quite as well in the previous generation, the stabilization here is very good. The smartphone records sound quite well too. Of course, it's inferior to Samsung, but I definitely can't call the recording quality bad here. This smartphone is one of the best when shooting with the front camera, both in good lighting and in low light conditions. The photo quality is mostly without issues. Let's list some shortcomings a little further on, but overall, the smartphone meets all basic needs for mobile photography. This smartphone allows you to take portrait photos with background blur up to 10x zoom, which again, no other flagship on the market currently offers us this feature. Landscape shots, food photography, zoom photos, instant photo, long exposure photos, night mode. The smartphone performed well in many tests. Also, thanks to the very nice telephoto lens, this smartphone produces excellent macro photos and macro videos. The smartphone performed well in Wi-Fi and mobile network speed tests, outperforming all other competitors in download speed. I also want to note that it has a good display with a very low level of PWM, which is very important for people sensitive to PWM. In the 3D Mark test, the smartphone impressed with its best stability, significantly outperforming Vivo and Samsung in that regard. Friends, another plus. This smartphone has a gorgeous design. It doesn't look like other smartphones, it has a unique character, it looks really cool externally. It feels very secure in hand. You can comfortably use it one-handed. You can easily take photos with one hand. Huawei did a great job. And they put the ultra-wide lens at the very top. With this smartphone, your finger will never get in the lens. I would consider the camera algorithms a questionable point. They are very aggressive. In some situations, that can be convenient. For example, at night with maximum photo zoom, Huawei outperformed Vivo in text readability specifically through image processing. No one would take photos at that level of zoom for posterity. However, being able to discern a distant inscription could be a useful scenario. But sometimes, the algorithms erase all the details from the photo. Whether it's tiles, trees, or facial hair, everything turns into a blurry mess. So it's a really strange situation that I can't determine whether it's a plus or a minus. There's another very strange situation. If in photo mode we have the second telephoto lens that works wonderfully at almost 10x zoom, then for some reason it simply didn't work in video recording, especially in 4K at 60 frames per second. Perhaps this will be fixed in future software updates, but for now we're just getting a crop from the main telephoto lens. Well friends, we've talked about the positives. Now let's move on to the downsides of the Huawei Pura 70 Ultra. there aren't many specific shortcomings when compared to other flagships. It lacks logarithmic shooting, HDR, and 8K video on the main camera module. Slow motion is only available in Full HD, even at 120 FPS. Competitors offer a richer selection of modes in this regard. This, I think, is a significant oversight by Huawei. Now let's move on to the nuances of photo taking. Selfies often come out pale and lifeless, even in good lighting. And in low light, any light source can overexpose them or cause strong glare. Also in low light, Huawei twice blurred my daughter's face. Apparently under these conditions, the front camera can't focus properly if there's more than one person in the frame. Another moment that's completely unclear to me is portrait photography on this smartphone. Why did Huawei limit the default options to just 3 focal lengths? The Pura 80 Ultra only has 1x, 2x, and then jumps straight to 5.6x. There's a real lack of an intermediate zoom level. Probably the biggest drawback for anyone who likes to tinker and shoot photos in RAW mode is the Pro mode, of course. Yes, it's possible to take RAW photos here, and they turn out quite pleasant in daylight. However, in low light conditions, unfortunately, RAW shooting on this smartphone isn't the best solution. Our competitors, Vivo and Samsung, offered RAW shooting. Vivo calls it Super RAW, and Samsung calls it Expert RAW. The quality of RAW photos on those smartphones significantly surpasses the Huawei Pura 80 Ultra in low light. Another point, I don't understand why Huawei can't implement such a simple function. You show your hand and take a photo. All the smartphones I've tested recently, except perhaps the iPhone, have this feature. Next minus, it's the weak hardware. I praised Huawei earlier for high stability under load, but in performance tests, the smartphone showed itself to be the weakest. It significantly lagged behind both Vivo and Samsung. The battery was also disappointing. On the second day of shooting, the smartphone discharged to 8%. That's the lowest result in our trio, and probably the main drawback of the Huawei Pura 80 Ultra is the lack of Google services and all the consequences that come with it. Yes, Google Play can be installed here, but you need to use software from other manufacturers. And then you are taking the risk yourself, trusting all your data to that manufacturer. We're going to briefly cover the pros and cons of Vivo and Samsung, as we've talked about them in detail in extensive reviews of those smartphones. X200 Ultra is one of the best smartphones when it comes to photography. It has a great ultra-wide lens, a powerful main camera, and one of the best telephoto lenses on the market, 200 megapixels. An excellent color reproduction makes it a really great photography smartphone. Photos are almost always juicy, beautiful, and processed, ready to post straight to social media. The Vivo camera itself is very convenient and user-friendly, with a ton of settings and shooting presets that aren't intimidating or confusing. The smartphone is good in other aspects as well. It has excellent battery life, which we've tested multiple times. It's quite powerful and performant, and the screen is pleasing with its low PWM level. The situation with video recording is complicated for Vivo, so I'm marking it as a contentious point. The ultra-wide lens shoots well, there are no questions about it, but the main lens isn't the best choice for video recording. This zoom level is too much. It's uncomfortable to film yourself. When shooting the surroundings, especially in low light, this lens shows quite unreliable stabilization. It constantly jerked the frame whenever I rotated the smartphones. But the weakest point of all Vivo phones, starting with the Vivo X100 Ultra, is definitely the front-facing camera. It works normally for selfies and photos. Now the video recording, it's just painful. The stabilization is weak, the picture quality is questionable, especially when shooting in low light. There's no global version, and setting up a Chinese smartphone can be a challenging task. It's great that we have a detailed guide on setting up the Chinese version of Vivo. A link to it will be in the description. And finally, the Samsung S25 Ultra. It's a good smartphone that performs all the basic tasks for taking photos and videos. Out of these three, it has the best stabilization, the best audio recording, and the most stable video portrait mode without any jitters, overexposure, or loss of focus. It offers 8K recording on all lenses, something none of the competitors provide. Regular 4K video recording on the main camera module is generally solid, both during the day and at night. Regarding photos, it will appeal to those who strive for natural results, and to those who don't like the exaggerated sharpness, saturation, and heavy smoothing that Chinese smartphones offer. We'll get to the downsides in a bit, but for now, let's focus on the positives. I can say that this is a powerful smartphone that showed good results in our tests. But the main plus for many international customers is that it's the simplest and most user-friendly smartphone. All Google services are present, no gimmicks with limitations, no Chinese characters, and no hassle with setup. Took it out of the box and I'm using it. And of course, this is the most interesting smartphone in terms of AI. We've talked about this in detail many times already. So, I can give you a link to our previous reviews of the S25 Ultra. So yes, in terms of convenience for everyday use, the S25 Ultra is one of the best options. Now let's talk about the downsides. This flagship, well, it's just not really about photography. It can handle daytime shots without significant zoom, but low-light photos or photos with a strong zoom, it's not suited for that. The list of included accessories is quite bare compared to Vivo and Huawei. It's frustrating that Samsung, back in the day, took inspiration from Apple and started being stingy. Also, a definite drawback is the huge PWM values, especially at low brightness. It's a perpetual problem with Samsung screens. Friends, and now the main question. Who should buy the new Huawei Pura 80 Ultra? And my answer is absolutely all those people who love the Huawei brand and have previously owned smartphones from this company. The people who don't care about Google services that much. I really liked this smartphone. In terms of photo and video capabilities, this smartphone has been significantly improved compared to the previous generation. I haven't seen other companies improve their top flagship phones this much in previous years. Friends, and if you liked this video and found it useful, be sure to like it and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments what you think of the new Huawei Pura 80 Ultra. And bye-bye everyone.